So we continue, and now it's an article sent to me by Terry McTarlow. Hopefully I can find it on the internet so you can download it to have it on your side. It's called Semiotic Seams, Fractal Dynamics of Re-entry. This essay concerns fractal geometry as a bridge between the imaginary and the real, mind and matter, conscious and unconscious. The logic rests upon Jung's theory of number as the most primitive archetype of order for linking observers with the observed. Whereas Jung focused upon natural numbers as the foundation for order that is already conscious, I offer fractal geometry with its endlessly recursive iteration on the complex number plane as the underpinning for a dynamic unconscious destined never to become fully conscious. Everywhere in nature, fractal separatrices articulate a paradoxical zone of bounded infinity that both separates and connects nature's edges. This last phrase is a sort of a key to what Terry MARKS-TARLOW is writing. It is in the frontier that everything is happening, not on the opposing sides, although they are the necessary dialectical energy. They need to be different. By occupying the space between dimensions and levels of existence, fractal boundaries exemplify re-entry dynamics of Areola's autonomous system, as well as Hofstadter, ever-elusive tangled hierarchy. Where brain and mind are most entwined. Rhymes. At this second-order cybernetic frontier, the horizon of observers observing the observation process remains infinitely complex and ever receding from view. I suggest that the property of self-similarity, by which the pattern of the whole permeates fractal parts of different scales, represents the semiotic sign of identity in nature. Begin with a quote by Louis Kaufman. Any distinction is wholly imaginary or imaginary, spelt E-Y-E, an act of creation, an act of the imagination. Each proof that convinces is a proof that uses imaginary values to reason to a true answer. Mathematics is about the consequence of making a distinction, as if there were such a thing as a distinction. It is all imaginary, and only the imaginary is real. Anyone reading the epigraph above is probably familiar with Louis Kaufman's virtual logic column, which periodically graces the pages of this journal. Writing about that magical twilight zone between observer and observed, Kaufman examines various systems of logic and mathematics. In the process, he highlights paradox while underscoring the hidden action of the imaginary necessary to bring forth the real world of everyday distinctions. By investigating the interplay between imaginary real, observer observed, that is detectable within fractal geometry, this essay follows in the same spirit. I argue for the importance of fractal dynamics to model entangled relations between observer and observed. To recognize the broad foundation of fractal geometry within infinite recursion on the imaginary plane can enhance our understanding of reality as a finitely perceived in nature. Conversely, to comprehend how fractals manifest ubiquitously at the joints in nature, in turn self-referentially, which is Hofstadter's beat, expands our understanding of mind, especially the deep relativity that exists between observer and observed at all scales of observation. I introduce self-similarity as a new symmetry in nature that represents the sign of identity. I introduce self-similarity as a new symmetry in nature that represents the sign of identity. Explored semiotically, self-similarity can be seen as a distinction that leads to no distinction. I relate this paradoxical equivalence of change and no change to the operation of cancellation within Spencer Brown's arithmetic of first distinctions, as well as to Varela's re-entry dynamics, characteristic of autonomous systems. My thesis is that fractal separatrices between inside and outside, self and other, subjective and objective levels, as well as conscious, unconscious underpinnings of experience, represent an imaginary, real foundation for the entangled co-creation of world and psyche. Number as the archetype for conscious order. Quote from Carl Jung: if a group of objects is deprived of every single one of its properties or characteristics, there still remains at the end its number, which seems to indicate that number is something irreducible, something which helps more than anything else to bring order into the chaos of appearances. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung came to view number as the most primitive quality of existence. By crafting an archetypal theory, his theory of number doubled over as a theory of mind. Jung attributed to number the power to bring order into the chaos of appearances. Referring to material existence not as objectively conceived, but rather as subjectively perceived by an observer. And here my comment, we need to remember that Jung was in intimate contact with both Heisenberg and Pauli. He was well aware of the findings of quantum mechanics, so to speak, informed first-hand or second-hand. Here, number links observers and observed, inner and outer worlds, in a way parallel to the second-order cybernetics. In the footsteps of Margaret Mead and Heinz von Förster, this viewpoint is carried forth eloquently in this journal by the musings of Ranulph Glanville. Quote, the whole point of second-order cybernetics is that it asserts there is no observation without an observer. There's nothing spoken without a speaker. There's no action without an actor. Jung viewed number as the realm where mind and matter meet, sometimes referred to as the psychoid level of existence, and at other times the unus mundus. Jung intuited that the realm of mathematical abstraction is discovered. At the same time, it is invented as an abstraction in the mind, indicating something qualitative about the subjective realm of meaning. For Jung, number serves as the most fundamental structure of perceived reality, the place where observers and observed merge at the level of synchronicity, symbol and meaning. Ooh, excuse me. In building a bridge between mind and matter, Jung and his dedicated follower, Marie-Louise von Franz, were interested primarily in the counting numbers as symbols and founts of inexhaustible metaphor during the production of conscious experience. Whether in dream, mythology, or art, the number 1 tends to symbolize undifferentiated unity. 2 signifies the first distinction or duality. 3 indicates dynamic change and movement away from the static opposition. And 4 suggests stable manifestation. In this paper, I move from the natural numbers that interested Jung to the number as manifested naturally in what Mandelbrot calls the fractal geometry of nature. I argue for a link between imaginary numbers as iterated recursively on the complex plane and self-reflexive underpinnings of the dynamic unconscious. A precedent for my approach exists in the work of Jungian psychologist and mathematician Robin Robertson. Robertson advances Jung's search for the archetype of order by tracing a history of qualitative development of human consciousness based on the evolution of quantitative mathematical discovery. I next describe 4 major stages evident before placing fractal geometry into the context of the 4th. In the first stage, knowledge of the counting numbers relates to primitive consciousness characteristic of many traditional tribes and young children. Here, the inner contents of the unconscious are unwittingly projected into the outer conscious experience. In cybernetic terms, observer and observed are unconsciously merged during the act of making, discovering distinctions in ongoing experience. Translated into the language of contemporary neuroscience, this stage depends upon procedural memory whose capacity is hardwired into the primitive brain. This type of memory is unconscious, in the more contemporary meaning of the word. Embraced by cognitive scientists and neuroscientists like Jim Grisby, Alan Shore, and Daniel Siegel. Whereas Freud's unconscious consisted of repressed knowledge, dynamically pushed beneath the surface of conscious awareness, contemporary neuroscientists view much of the brain's work as unconscious in that self-organizational processes, appropriate neural circuitry functioning well beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. This distinction becomes critical to my later assertion of fractal geometry as the abstract formalization for the ever-receding threshold between conscious and unconscious processes. Stage 2 in collective human consciousness involves the emergence of zero as a symbol around the dawn of the Christian era. Within Persian semiotics, zero represents an important portmanteau, a sign that carries double meaning, in this case embodying paradox. Zero is a symbol for no thing that also means something. In modern number notation, zero serves as a placeholder. Put it in to keep a place to show 10,000, 100,000. That enables us to endlessly to recycle the same 10 digits. By eliminating the need for a different symbol to represent each new number, zero provides an invisible underground unity to the number system. Here we see early glimmerings of Kaufman's virtual logic, the play of imagination that sharpens focus on real distinctions. Recycled digits brought the first formal sign of fractal dynamics, albeit in in-choked form, because full arithmetic expression involves self-similar structure on ever grander scales of magnitude. across the tens, the hundreds, and the thousands numbered columns. Whereas modern number notation represents a somewhat trivial example of self-similarity. Sunni philosopher Patrick Rim, Gary Marr, and Paul St. Denis, 98, asserts more significantly that of all mathematics and logic can be modeled on the computer as an infinitely expanding fractal system. So I'm going to make a summary here. This is a segue going from the article in the book to the article from Terry MARKS-TARLOW sent to me. And once more, one need to remember that understanding itself is fractal. The very idea that if I understand a certain object A, there is nothing mirroring that thing in my brain that I need to sort of digest or take in. This is so clearly mentioned by Rodolphe Gachet in the Chain of the Mirror, which I can recommend. It's called nullification. It's the death of knowledge. In fractality, for me to take in this, my understanding of this needs to be completely different, have to be different. That takes time. I need to create that difference. Second, it doesn't fit into my system. And this is, of course, very similar to the difference, speaking in E.M. McGill-Christian terms, left hemisphere and right hemisphere. The understanding of the left hemisphere is neo-academia. It's the idea that you can fully understand one thing by mentally copying it, and that there is no movement. Your own status is insignificant. You are no longer an observer in that neo-academic system based on Newton. So you digest it, or you do like a Xerox machine. So the object of knowledge here, or the information, is put in the Xerox machine, and you press copy paste. You get a copy within your head of the same thing. That's the left hemisphere take. And in that left hemisphere take, I would be the perceiver, and this would be the perceived. This is incredibly questioned these days in the science of cognition. Affordances doesn't allow for a perceiver and perceived. It's a much more dynamic system, and we often pointed to Wittgenstein as understanding. It's a misuse of the language game to say I am the perceiver. Who perceived that? It's not a normal question in any language game. So it's not of reality. It is a misuse of language that makes you and your understanding fractality not work as smoothly anymore. It is like you are untraining yourself. You do not exercise your fractality. The fractality is a movement that needs to be trained. And by copy-pasting something, you make it lazy. You make it less complex. You make it less unique. And as we said, it's not as longer as idiosyncratic. It becomes, the jagged lines becomes linear more and more. There is a smudging of the fractality. Less fractality means less possibility of understanding. Modern education diminishes the capacity for understanding. For each year in educational system, you lose some of this filigrane and complicated fern-like complexities. You lose your capacity to understand. And once you go to a certain level, you begin to tense up bodily, which is a sure sign of a deteriorating of an understanding and function. No human being that has tensions can understand any longer. Now we are in a spiral that goes down. Less understanding makes for less taking in and more tension, and in the end we become sort of imitators of the Xerox machine. And we start to put these things that we sort of conquered into Newtonian, Heideggerian, Newtonian Cartesian coordinate system. And we think that the memory bank here is where the storage is, has nothing to do with the fractality. No, not at all. It's the same fractality, it's just one. And it contains memory, cognition, awareness, and attention in one. Deficit in one aspect is a deficit in all aspects. It's a oneness in the fractality that is not possible in the Newtonian system. There's a huge difference there. And what Terry MARKS-TARLOW is pointing to so forth in her exposure of the number system is, of course, the uniqueness of the numbers, that they are absolutely unique. One and one doesn't make two in fractality. It is exact. The exact system is completely different from the numerical system. So we might stop talking about high numbers and talk about more complexities. I earlier recommended that we use ordinal numbers because they introduce the concept of an order. An order doesn't exist in new academia. Everything is just pushed from every side. only an observer can make order. It chooses first one, and the second, then the first. This is how it could be fractally understood. The Newtonian way is just pounding and throwing disconnected bits of what the fractality doesn't recognize as knowledge. And usually in the Newtonian system it's called information. Splattered, splintered, non-directional, going nowhere. And of course, this is the nullification. This is what Rudolf Gesher means, that all modern knowledge nullifies itself. It becomes zero, as Terry MARKS-TARLOW pointed out here, zero as a symbol. But in this case, it's zero also of not being able to keep up the edges. Maybe there's a question here. Let's be careful with that little green light here. I'll check it out that it's still on.
I will repeat a little bit from page 51. Stage 2 in collective human consciousness involves the emergence of zero as a symbol around the dawn of the Christian era. And we don't have, historians don't insert a number zero. So Christ wasn't born in year zero, he was. So there is one before and then one after. There is no year zero, it doesn't exist. And now I think I have a theory, or at least that's why we don't have it. So the Greeks had a horror vacui. They were afraid of the empty space. In one way, the zero really represents empty space because you have a hole there, visually speaking, and the zero was taken in the West very late compared to India, and even the Mayans had it, but in West we didn't have it. So I think that it represents horror vacui because of the visually also, because you have the hole there, hole with an H. But really, to refer to Rosen again, the hole with an H represents also the hole with a W. So you need the hole to have the wholeness. The zero is a really important number to get around that. And I also like what she writes here, that zero is also a placeholder, and it made me think about Heidegger's Gestell. So, and you spoke about Newton's Cartesian system, that is like a placeholder, and we are somewhat outside of it. But so placeholder is here in positive sense, because the zero has, you can multiply the zeros many times. And excellent your point that we should use ordinary numbers because it introduces order, that is the observer. But I would like to ask you something. You mentioned, so people often speak about facts. We have facts. One example of a fact is 1 + 1 is 2. But you said that's not really fractally true. But please explain that short summary. You have very little time left. If you could please. So why it's not 1 + 1, 2, fractally speaking, so to say?
It has to do with that numbers themselves are actually fractal. So the system itself contains fractality, which means, and this is a very odd feature, we cannot keep the ordinary sense of numbers as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the idea that there's an equal distance between them. The only way for numbers to have a working attitude is that their themselves are jagged and unique. So in that case, for 6 to have the capacity to hold 3 × 2, it needs to be different from 3 × 2. It's a very, very difficult thing to understand. It is really molding one's brain cells to understand how can it be that 6 is different from 3 times 2? It has to be. Think of 6 as a complexity, a jagged complexity. Only by that jagged complexity can it read off 3 times 2 as being 6. It doesn't represent, take this thing again here, it doesn't represent, as I said, there is not a mirror image. Think in the head of number 6, there is no mirror image out there that says 3 times 2 and they are equal. No, they are different. They are definitely different. Therefore 6 cannot be 6. And the distance between 5 and 6 is not the same as between 4 and 5. And this is a tough nut to crack, and I think, Kalle, it's Friday afternoon. You brought the subject maybe into the most ravenous and horribly complicated things, and especially when it means reorganizing thinking completely. And that takes training, but a good thing to repeat is that 3 times 2 doesn't equal 6. 6 needs to be idiosyncratic, it needs to be talismanic. Otherwise, it doesn't have the capacity to hold the information. Or why not think of Pfeiffer's moving objects? The complex movement is fractal. It's a movement that learns. It's a movement that plans. It's a movement that understands. There is no CPU. That model is gone in the science of cognition. It's gone since 10 years ago. We do no longer think, as they still do in the educational system. You're right to that. In the educational system, without exception, this model is the case of mirroring. Always. There's no strand of, let's say, preschool or compulsory school or high school or university. No strands, yet. So all are selling the wrong model. We know it's wrong. And oddly enough, it is proven as well. Mandelbrot is new. It's a new invention, but we know today the fractal nature of reality, and it includes actually numbers themselves. Heck, it involves dimensionality, geometry. Where does number come from? It comes from geometry. Without geometry, there is no numbers. So if geometry is fractal, numbers are fractals as well. So they don't carry sameness, identity. Another way of thinking that are the atoms. We discussed 4 lectures ago that the atoms can never be identical. Neither can they be different. But here's the most important thing, they cannot be identical. So the things that makes up 6, whatever those things were, sheeps, stones, because there were things in the beginning, as Lakoff and Johnson is showing. We forget that. We need to remember that again. Maybe this is number 2. Here you can clearly see there are differences here. But still, if I hold this in the air, this will correspond to this 2. This is how you should be thinking. That's a segue into fractal numbering. And I will actually look, there could be by now a fractal mathematical book. I don't know. But definitely I recommend Lakoff Johnson and their tremendous seminal book about mathematics. It's an alarm bell that makes you understand there are no equal numbers. And for this to have the power to show to, they need to be different, idiosyncratic. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the jagged coastline of Norway to keep knowledge. I hope that was helpful. See, very careful, I can't give it to Kalle here. I think I turned the microphone off earlier by accident. It's a very delicate.
I can hold it actually. I think it's easier. Yes, not a long time ago, I watched a YouTube discussion, and they gave an example of about as an absolute truth, 1+1 is 2, and I thought there was something strange here, as if facts are passively out there. And I think you gave an excellent example with this. Let's say by showing two different objects, if you put them together, they are still two different objects. And that's a good. And I was also thinking about Karl Rovilli's Relation of Quantum Physics. There he uses the example of 2 electrons. And he emphasizes that entanglement is not dance for 2, but for 3. That is, you have 2 electrons. If one is red, the other is also red. But you need a third person to observe their entanglement. That is an external observer. So entanglement is a dance for 3 because you need to check them. So to say 1+1 is 2, that's only if you have a third person doing the checking. And that relates back to Johan's, what you said, that is better. We should have ordinary numbers because it enters order, that is the observer. So excellent, Hans, excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, back to you.
Yeah, maybe a third help here could be that am I in the middle of the? It's 1/3. Well, I move this way to get into the middle. 1/3 way of thinking of this is the atoms, of course. You understand historically atoms were developed by Newtonian thinking, and they needed to be what we now know doesn't make any sense, but they need to be same, just as space is same. And I think that is the sameness that obfuscate my thinking, did until recently. And I have to be perfectly honest, I don't understand it yet. I need to train my head. This will not happen directly. And sometimes, well, 90% of the time I go back to that, but it's the only thing that makes sense. Lakoff Johnson shows it comes from the things, and they're all different. Even if this is a manufactured cup, there will be differences to the next manufactured cup. They would not be in the same place, would not be in the same time zone. There would be small differences as well. So identity doesn't exist. That's a very, very tough nut to crack. And now I believe that the distance between 5 and 6 is not the same as between 6 and 7. But catch me, call me 6 o'clock in the morning. I would still believe it's equidistance. And I have friends, I know now, one mathematician, he will never ever give up that misconception. He will not go through the work of understanding that. He wouldn't see the point. And this is the same, very similar to the work that Bishop and Brauer tried to do with mathematics, to teach people to train themselves not to use the law of the excluded middle. And people would just go out and say, why should I do that? You would take away a lot of explorations, would no longer be possible. And you will take away something I think I have, like a super force, like a Superman thing. Well, I understand their reasoning. They will lose, it will feel, but they lose nothing. It's not a superpower to produce meaningless equations. And that's the reason why constructive mathematics is strongest in computer science. because they have a goal there. They have something to achieve, whereas a lot of mathematics today is unusable. So there are psychological tendencies here. There are strivings. In a way, it feels safer also. It feels unsafe that the distance between 2 and 3 is not the same as between 3 and 4. How can I pay my bills? It's terror. But trust me, you can still pay your bills. It doesn't take equidistance. Actually, for your billing system to work, they need to be fractal, because everything in the world is fractal, even your bills. Okay, I say thank you very much. Over and out from Coffee Shop Tintin. Bye bye.